Good things take time. This is kind of a universally understood idea that is so not practiced very frequently within our current Western culture. Taking time is, let's say, a valuable resource. And especially for us within the United States, because our time is often stretched so thin, taking time to do something requires commitment. It requires a level of recognition that I am going to do this thing, and I'm going to take the time necessary to do it. I think we've all experienced what it means for us to not take enough time to do something, right? Perhaps we've been cooking a meal and we simply have gotten impatient with the chicken that just needs to be done now because all of the kids are home from school and we've got to get dinner on the table and things like that. But guess what? The chicken needs to cook for a certain amount of time in order for it to be safe to eat. And it would be inadvisable for us to, let's say, take the chicken out of the oven too soon, because then we're putting ourselves and our kids and our family at risk for getting sick. Taking the time takes time. And because of that, taking time takes discipline. Anytime that we undertake getting better at something, we always have to take time. And in fact, even more specifically, we have to plan. We have to make plans to take time. If you ever want to get better at a hobby or a craft or a trade or, dare I say, your career, you have to take time to do so. In fact, most careers require some extra, let's say, personal training time to be able to take off to, let's say, get better at your craft. And in order to do so, that means that you have to choose to do something rather than doing other things. We have to be able to step back and take the time to hone our edges. To put this in kind of maybe a more kind of rooted and earthy sense, if you ever take up the hobby of woodworking, one of the things about woodworking is that it is an inexact process with a material that is notoriously unique to work with, wood. And it takes getting to know the thing you're working with, the wood you're working with, because there are ways that even using the correct techniques on this material will actually yield the things that you don't want. Instead of a smooth surface, all of a sudden you'll have what's called tear out, where you have this part of the wood fibers that tear away from each other rather than having that smooth surface. And it can be really frustrating because it takes more time to fix those things. Often, in fact, if you mess up a piece like that, you have to just go back to the scrap pile and you have to make a whole other piece, or you have to repair that piece in some way, and it takes time. But taking time doesn't have to be frustrating. It really doesn't have to be frustrating. And taking time requires a virtue that is as old as the classical virtues, but a virtue that is also deeply spiritual, which is the virtue of patience. Patience. Or another word that we use in the King James Version of the Scriptures is the word long-suffering, which I think is actually an even better translation. Long-suffering. Because there is an avenue in which taking time really doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good for us to do so. Taking time requires us to be able to choose specifically, and choose specifically for a long term to be able to sit with this particular activity, this particular thing, until I improve at it or get better at it, or simply until I actually get something out of it, right? But that runs up against one of our current cultural phenomena within the West, capital W West again, which is efficiency. There is a level at which our wider culture values efficiency and convenience over and against time. After all, how many times have we seen in commercials recently, get this now, limited time offer, right? There are these things that actually try to increase your anxiety about the fact that you're going to miss out if you don't move now. Or, I don't have enough time, I've got to do this right now. Or, even better, I see this in the martial arts world a lot, you want to get that black belt now. In my own sort of way, I can't tell you how many times I have run across students in martial arts that are just in a hurry. They're in a hurry to get someplace. And if you actually look at the history of martial arts and what the art of martial arts is, you might actually look at this person and say, why are you in such a hurry? Because martial arts is a discipline. It's something that you have to come back to over and over again. It's something that you have to invest time into, lots of time into, in order to get good at it. And there's no such thing as a fast track to getting to where you want to go in an art like that. And to be completely honest, I really don't think that there is such a thing as a fast track in life either. There are certainly ways that we can get better at things more efficiently, but is efficiency really the goal? Is efficiency a virtue? We might want to be careful about that, because the more that we think that I don't have time to do something, the more we might be shielding ourselves from the real problem, which is that it's not that we don't have time to do something, it's that we simply don't have the patience to do it. And we need to be honest with ourselves about that. Because when we talk about marriage, as we're going to be talking about today, marriage is one of those sacraments in which the vows themselves confine you in time. And this is something that is maybe not necessarily overt within the ceremony. However, it is something at least understood to mean that we're making a lifelong commitment to this particular person. And in the Christian sense, this is meant to be parallel to the idea that God has made a covenant with us in perpetuity, for all time. And the virtue of patience, the virtues of understanding what long-term relationships look like, is not something that you'll ever see the fruit of if you don't take the time. And this is the point of what Matthew Bullimore writes in this chapter. And one of the things before you even start, marriage is a controversial subject right now. And it's not just because of the question over LGBTQ marriage. And really, it's that I think is the presenting issue that actually underlies a deeper issue. That's what we popularly will see as being the problem with marriage right now. No, I think that a better symptom to look at of the problem is the divorce rate. Divorce rates within the US are nearly 50%. And the thing is that we can argue over what caused that. However, the simple fact of the matter is that, and this is something that I have to deal with. The simple fact of the matter is that the average person who comes to be married in whatever setting, whether either in church or otherwise, the average couple who comes together to get married, there is a 50-50 chance that that marriage is not going to last. And in fact, there's a significant chance that that marriage is going to not last 10 years. In fact, and this is maybe the sad part, there are some people who see a 10-year marriage as a success. The question that we need to then ask is, what do we mean when we talk about marriage then? And more specifically, we need to really drill into what we mean by Christian marriage. Marriage has been an anthropological phenomenon since we know that humans have existed. People have been being married way, way, way before we've had the revelation of the covenant to Abraham in the Old Testament. We know that marriage has been a thing for much longer than the Bible has even been around. But we need to talk about what Christian marriage means, because Christian marriage is a particular kind of understanding of marriage, not a universal understanding. It uses universal understandings of what marriage means in some cases, but we have to also say that Christian marriage is a unique expression. And that's where we need to talk about the vows. The vows in Christian marriage are a particular expression of what it means to be married because we believe it has something to do with who God is. So when we talk about marriage today, as Matthew Bullimore talks about, we're not going to be talking about the controversies around who can get married. We're not going to be talking about the history of marriage in the church. We're not going to be talking about the more kind of hot-button issues around what exactly it means for procreation involving in marriage. What we're going to be talking about instead is what the time aspect of marriage is. Because I found this to be a really fascinating perspective on the question. Because it actually really does have to do with vows. Because vows have to do with perpetuity. I don't make a vow just for 10 years. I make a vow in perpetuity, as to the best of my ability, and as the marriage vow says, until death do we part. I am also going to be speaking as someone who is married. Someone who has been married going on 11 years now. So, congratulations to us beating the whatever the good average is, whatever that means. But that being said, let's talk about what time is when it comes to making the vow for marriage and why that particular perspective might actually shed some light on an underexplored issue that we might have within the modern understanding of vows. All right, so let's talk about it. Let's talk about marriage. Marriage is the sacrament of two people making a vow before God that this is the person of whom I am choosing to be joined to for the rest of my life. Okay? And within the marriage ceremony itself, you might be familiar with the traditional language. When the minister in question asks both the people who have come, do you take, insert name here, to be your wedded wife? Do you take this person to be your wedded husband? Do you choose this person? And then we get more specific, right? We then talk about, do you choose this person to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for rich or for poor, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? That is a heavy vow. If we really kind of think about it just in those terms, we are choosing this person over and against every circumstance that we can possibly imagine, to have and to hold, this person being the person of whom we are each other's possession, really. In fact, echoing St. Paul's idea of husbands and wives are each other's, not their own. And likewise, for better or for worse, the things that are better in life or worse in life, in sickness and in health, there's no such thing as a marriage in which the other person is feeble and is sick and like, okay, I'm discarding this other person. No, we stick with the person. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, regardless of our economic status, until death do us part. That's the kicker, right? I choose this person until physical death takes me. Okay? big vow there, right? But let's take a step back and talk about marriage as taking time. This is, I think, a significant point for us to consider. When we talk about marriage, we must talk about taking time. Time. When we're talking about taking time, what we're meaning is commitment. And commitment means that we are choosing something specific. And we're choosing something specific for a time. Okay? Now again, talking about the marriage commitment is indeed a lifelong commitment. Okay? And in this way, marriage shares a common reality with, in fact, ordination and with monastic vows. It is a lifelong commitment of which we are committing ourselves to. One that, as we say within the marriage rite, let no one separate. Okay? As Jesus himself says, what God has joined together, let no one separate, or let no man put asunder. Let no man rend apart, if that makes sense. So, taking time is implicitly understood in the marriage. Commitment is more obviously understood in the marriage, but time is one of those things that can be often misunderstood. Because does taking time, what exactly do we mean by that? And this is where we're going to get to what kind of time. When we think about time, we are often thinking about this in what we would call a linear format. We're thinking about time as I'm at this point and I'm going to that point. Or it's 10 o'clock right now and we are moving forward towards 11 o'clock, right? And we think about time as, let's say, a amount of something. And it's not to say that that's wrong, but to only think of time as in these sort of like linear points in time is not exactly what we're talking about. Because perhaps you've experienced this, or perhaps you know people who've experienced this. There are all kinds of marriages within the world in which it does not matter the amount of time that someone has been together. That is indeterminative of whether it is a true marriage or not. I'm going to give you two examples, okay? One example is a marriage that could not be recognized. There's actually a famous example of this within U.S. history, which is that marriages between owners and the enslaved, okay? There have been a number of different circumstances in which there were, let's say, secret marriages amongst those populaces that could not be recognized. Were they any less marriages? Well, we run into a problem, right? Is marriage determined by the civil magistrate or the government, or is marriage determined by something else? That's something that we have to square with, right? And in the Church of England, where Matthew Bullimore is writing about, he runs into this exact problem with the couple that comes to him to be married in the first part of the chapter, right? He is both acting as a civil servant of the Church of the Parliament of England, but he's also acting as a religious servant of the Church of England. And so, in a way, Father Bullimore is caught in a weird situation where he is not able, by his civil authority, to recognize this marriage. However, by his religious authority, he is able to recognize this lifelong commitment. So the thing is that any less of a marriage than a marriage that is recognized by the state? Here's a counterexample. There have been numerous examples of this, but how many examples just within history can we think of people who have been married for all of their lives who have been very clearly not in a marriage relationship? Okay? Again, don't want to put too fine a point on this, but in the creation of the Church of England, in the breakaway from the Roman Catholic Church, it was under the rule of one Henry VIII. Henry VIII was very concerned with his ability to produce a male heir because of a lot of other politics that were happening within the monarchy in England at that time. But we have a real question as to whether Henry's wives that he had, even though he was, according to the magisterial recognition of both Rome, for some of them, and England, were those actual marriages? There is a real question to be had, right? They were recognized at a point in time by the state. They were recognized for some of the time by the church, but were they really marriages? What kind of time are we talking about? Those marriages that were recognized, did they actually take time? And so we need to talk about different conceptions of time, right? We have chronos, time. Chronology is where we get the word from, okay? It's a funny little Greek word that talks about the flow of time, the thing that we talk about when we're talking about our watch, right? But there's a different type of time. In fact, even the Greek New Testament differentiates between the type of time we're talking about. There is chronos time, which is one type of time, but there is also a time called kairos time. Kairos time is about an enduring age of something, okay? This, by the way, is closely associated with the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is right now, okay? Does that mean chronologically it's right now? Well, obviously, if we take that literally, then the kingdom of God was supposed to have been right around the corner about the time of Jesus. Where is the kingdom of God? Well, obviously, if you read the New Testament, Jesus is very clearly using different kinds of language to talk about something that is so big and outside of our ability to understand that we've got to use metaphor to get to it, right? So when we're talking about marriage, we're not just talking about chronos time, chronology. We're talking about it's a time, it's an age, it is a set-apart thing that has its own sort of time, its own sort of environment that is in there, which is why I found this to be a really interesting thing. Marriage as school. I really liked this example in here, and I probably liked the example because it was a metaphor of none other than Archbishop Rowan Williams, who is one of my personal favorite theologians of the past 50 years. But marriage as school. This is a really, I think this is a really maybe game-changing idea about marriage. Not that it is any new idea, but I think it just needs to be renewed. Marriage as a school of love. And by that, what we're meaning is that how do we know how to love well? Well, in marriage, there is a particular difference between the sacrament of marriage and other sacramental rites we've been talking about. And the chief difference is that marriage, instead of the vow in marriage being between the gathered community of the church and the person coming forward for baptism or confirmation before God, instead, the vow in marriage is between two people with God as witness, or excuse me, God as guarantor, so marriage is distinct from the other ones we're going to be talking about because the vows that the couple are making are to each other in the presence of God. Okay? So God is effecting the marriage, because again, baptism, confirmation, marriage, ordination, we are not the ones who make it work. But marriage is it has a little bit of a different, let's say, direction. The direction of the sacrament is towards the other. And in that way, we are having two people who make lifelong commitments to each other, with God as the blessing and guarantor of that relationship. In other words, God's doing it, okay? So God is main actor, guarantor, but the two people are vowing before God to each other that they are going to, having to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, richer, for sickness and in health, until death do us part, to love this person specifically. And in that way, they are entering into a relationship that, in very much an interesting parallel, is a school. When we enter into the marriage relationship, for those of you who are married or who have been married, when we enter into this relationship, I imagine that most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, didn't know what we were getting ourselves into, right? We didn't know what we were getting ourselves into for multiple reasons. Number one is that we learn very quickly that the person who I'm pledging myself to, who I've spent all this time with already, I don't know the single thing about them whenever it comes to all of a sudden living together with the person. We discover all kinds of things about each other that we didn't know before. We discover all kinds of things that make each other anxious or annoyed or angry or feel all kinds of negative emotions about the relationship, which I want to say pretty strongly is one of the reasons why I think the divorce rate's so high. And I'm not saying that it's because of all of these things that irritate people. I think we don't take time. We don't have patience to deal with the other person's stuff. To be completely honest, when we run into those parts in our marriage, when we run into those places in which we need to take time to work through, how many times, I'll speak from experience here, how many times have I heard that people don't have the patience to do that? How many times have we heard the phrase, I have fallen out of love with the person? Why did you fall out of love with the person? My argument in that particular case is that you have a faulty idea of love. You didn't take time to work through what the issues were, okay? And again, I'm not trying to make light of circumstances that are truly in need of intervention. I'm not making light of that. But we have to admit that there is a blithe sort of recognition of falling in and out of love as easily as waking up the next day, as easily as the other person putting on too much weight, as easily as the other person, oh, I didn't know this about them before I chose to be married to them. Guess what? You didn't know 90% of the other person before you got married to them. So, are we taking time? And are we going to school? Are we willing to be schooled? Are we willing to learn how to love someone specifically for the rest of our lives? Are we willing to subject ourselves, as we said we did in the marriage ceremony in the church, to the other person for the rest of our lives, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do us part? If we are unwilling to do that, we should not have made the vow to begin with. And if we're unwilling to do that, we need to re-examine a Christian assumption of marriage. Here's where the rubber hits the road. As I said earlier, one of the things that we need to figure out in this whole taking time thing, we need to figure out, are we in a Christian marriage? Or even better, do I want a Christian marriage? Another provocative question here, okay? And this is not just for those who are in the church, this is also those who are outside the church, okay? When you come to me, when you come to a pastor of a congregation and you want to be married, you and your significant other show up at my doorstep and you say that you want to get married. Here is what you're in for if you come to my office, okay? We're going to talk about, what do you mean by marriage? And again, not in a confrontational manner, but again, do we actually understand what we're doing? Do we actually understand what a Christian marriage looks like? Because this right here is deeply tied to who we think God is. Because if we think that God is a certain way, or God is a certain kind of entity that is not lining up with the Christian expression of God, we are going to get marriage wrong. Just quite bluntly. If we have a faulty conception of what we think God has done for us, we are never going to be able to understand what we're doing in marriage. Because if we truly take seriously that God is the one who's causing this marriage to happen. And by the way, just to kind of clarify, in the marriage ceremony, it's very clear in the Book of Common Prayer, I am not the one who marries them. I am witnessing and blessing. Very, very intentional words here. I'm not the one who marries people. Okay? God's the one who marries people. These people vow to each other before God. I'm not the one who marries them. So just as a clarification, this is why this is so important. If the couple do not have a good conception of who God is, they're not going to understand what they're promising. Because one of the chief things that we know about God in the Christian tradition is God's fidelity. And not to stress the point here, but one of the chief things that you can know about God, if you read the Bible, is God's unending patience, fidelity, love, and compassion towards his people. And in fact, if we just kind of look at it this way, God, in a lot of ways, is not only the supreme example, but God is the one who takes time. God's the one who takes time in the Bible. And I don't even have the time in this class to be able to discuss all of the ways in which that happens. But let me give you just a couple of examples. The chief image that we have of God in the prophet Hosea is husband, fidelitous husband, faithful husband. Faithful husband, even to the extreme of being faithful to the unfaithful wife. In fact, to the even more extreme of the symbol of the prophet Hosea going and marrying a prostitute and calling her to be his wife and having children with her as an image of God's relationship with Israel. If we just take a moment, that is a wild picture of who God is. And yet that's a biblical picture of who God is. Not even to say Jesus. God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. God did not send the Son into the world to condemn it, John 3:17, but that the world may have life in his name. Okay? So God's fidelity is a chief understanding of who God is. And if we think that about God, you know what that means about Christian marriage? Fidelity. That's actually a chief understanding of what Christian marriage is. Now, again, I don't want to blithely pass over the real issues that can happen in marriages that come apart. And again, I don't even want to hit the examples of abuse in marriage, which is a real thing, a real tragic thing that has to have intervention. Okay? So we need to take those seriously. Of course we do. However, we still have to hold to the fact that when we're talking about Christian marriage, we are talking about who God is, and if we're talking about who God is, we cannot avoid fidelity. Okay? And that fidelity is, in fact, having to do with time. Because fidelity, by necessity, is a long-term prospect. In fact, and here's something that is helpful for us to think about. We don't know how to be committed unless we take time. This is a funny catch-22 of this, right? Well, how can I be committed if I don't know how to do it yet? Well, let's turn the question back. Did you know how to be married as soon as you walked down the aisle? Of course you didn't, right? No one knows how to be married as soon as the ceremony is over, which maybe gives us a little bit of an idea as to maybe we don't need to be spending so much money on the wedding. Maybe we should spend a lot of money, a lot of time and money on making sure that, let's say, life after the ceremony is ready for the marriage. Okay? Because the marriage is not what happens in the church. The marriage is what happens when you go out the doors. Okay? So taking time is a part of that fidelity. And you don't know how to be loyal until you take time. You don't know how to do the discipline of marriage until you have to do it, right? And if we don't have an undergirding sense that we are vowed for life, fidelity, if we don't have that sense that the person in this relationship is equally fidelitous to me as I am to them, no matter what may happen, then that breaks apart the very foundation of what we're trying to build here, okay? And so, all of this circle here, taking time as a part of fidelity, as a part of who we think God is, as a part of what we think we're doing in marriage, is in fact a part of that process. The taking of time to get better at being married. By the way, I think a very comforting thing about newlyweds is, guess what? If you've been recently married, one of my family members just got married this past weekend. You just got married, guess what? You're bad at marriage right now. And that's okay, because you get better at marriage, okay? In fact, it's assumed you're going to get better at marriage, because no one knows how to be married right out of the box. No, it takes wear-in. It takes time for us to be able to get good at this thing, okay? And that's not a bad thing. You're gonna go through sickness and health. You're gonna go through poorer and richer. You're gonna go through things like that, okay? And the reason why we make the vows is so that when we do go through those things, that we stick together in fidelity. But one of those other kind of interesting taking time and the school of learning how to love is where we need to talk about procreation. Because when we talk about procreation, this is an interesting aspect of marriage that doesn't necessarily have to only do with the purpose of the marriage. In traditional Christian theology, especially within the patristic time period, one of the assumptions, and again, this could be chalked up to either a cultural assumption or otherwise, one of the assumptions of marriage is that there's going to be babies, okay? And you can see that in a, let's say, oppressive sense, in that often what ended up happening was the reduction of the woman's role in the marriage as simply the baby factory, to be just blunt about it, okay? However, there's a way in which we can talk about this that is, in fact, I think significantly important, because the role of procreation and kids is in fact having to do with time. And not only that, it's also having to do with commitment and fidelity. And not just within the sexual relationship. This is an important aspect, because both of these things are also pointing to, and I'm going to put a big word up here, an eschatological reality. What I mean by this is that, as Matthew Bullimore, I think, excellently put, procreation and offspring, and I want to note, this does not mean that it is biological children. It can also include adoptive children and otherwise like that, okay? But the having of children is, in fact, a time-focused reality that actually displaces the focus on self. When you have kids, for those of you who have kids or grandkids or foster kids or things like that, just to put it plainly, kids don't let you be self-focused. Kids don't let you be self-focused. Now, there is a level at which understanding of self is important, and taking time to rest is important. However, I think this is actually a really fascinating thing to be said. Kids do not let you self-obsess, because you are having to focus on the outside. You have to focus on the other. And the other, for parents, is the child. We are not only learning how to love each other, we actually are having our loves being outpoured towards others outside of ourselves. And in fact, we are learning in that school of marriage what it means for us to love my neighbor as myself. There is a recent author in one of her books that I think importantly said, children are the strange neighbors that occupy your house for about 16 years of their life. The strange neighbor, kind of like that, because you are having to learn how to love someone completely exterior to your vowed relationship with your spouse. But it's not disconnected, though, because the eschatological reality is this. Kids are the sign that I'm not going to be around forever. To put it in the way that St. John Chrysostom did, as Matthew Bullimore said, wherever there are children, there is death. That's a very spiky way of putting that, and John Chrysostom is very spiky in the way that he says things. But what he's meaning is that where there is new life, there is death. Where there is death, there is new life. And that's a theological reality in the light of the resurrection of Jesus. But in the marriage reality, it is in fact a recognition I'm not going to be around forever. And that in fact I have to be thinking about those who come after me. And not only that, I have to be loving those who come after me in a way that forces me to grow in the love of Christ. I have to learn how to love the next generation. And perhaps that can say something to our sometimes obsessive focus on generational dynamics within culture and church. You know, the boomers and the Gen X and the Gen Z and the millennials and, you know, and the, Gen Alpha now or whatever. Maybe part of the thing that will help us bridge the generational dynamics is simply a recognition that Christ has commanded me. I must learn to love the generation after me. And that is, in fact, one of the time-taking aspects of marriage. The time-taking, in this particular sense, is recognizing the end of time, the end of my life, the time in which I am not a factor, the time in which I am caught up into that timelessness of God. And so there's a really good thing about the procreation aspect as it comes to time-taking, because kids don't let you self-focus. And they also take time, don't they? They take time out of your day, they take time out of your schedule, they take time. But it's not something in which is irreturnable, because love takes time, and love has to trump those other aspects of our life that we are tempted to displace the importance of learning how to love someone. So taking time in the aspect of kids, in the aspect of procreation, of our foster kids or our adoptive children, things like that. This is, in fact, a significantly important part of that marriage vow. And likewise, as we think about time-taking, we also need to be just completely clear with each other that time-taking is going to also include bad times, which is where we're going to end our final part of this chapter, talking about bad times. Talking about bad times. The chief reason why people say that they get divorced is not because of abuse. And it's not because of irreconcilable differences. And again, this is not speaking to the real pastoral circumstances, the real cultural circumstances in which people's lives are in danger. Okay? This is just a part of the Western culture. The chief reason for marriages dissolving is money issues. You can look up the statistics. Chief reason given. And again, we can argue about whether this is true across the board or not. The chief reason why people get divorced, according to statistics in the United States, is money. Money issues. The chief reason why this is because there are, and in fact, this is some red flags, but I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into some of the marriage prep that I do with some of our families. One of the things that I ask our prospects for marriage, whenever I go through it, I ask them two questions at the very beginning, because these are giant red flags when it comes to the longevity of marriages. I ask, one, do you have a prenuptial agreement? Prenuptial agreements for me are big red flags, because we are making an exit strategy for if this thing doesn't work, which means that, in my opinion, we have a faulty idea of what Christian marriage is. Okay? The second one is, are you going to consolidate your bank accounts into one? I cannot tell you how many times. In fact, very recently, I am aware of a circumstance in which the lack of consolidation of bank accounts. In other words, I have my account over here, you have your account over there. I cannot tell you how many times that particular issue, when it comes to the simple nuts and bolts of like how a marriage functions, who pays for what, I cannot tell you how many times that specific issue has been the cause of so much strife that it didn't have to be. The lack of simply joining your bank accounts together, almost like you're getting married, right? Almost like you are maybe in this thing together. The lack of awareness of money issues, or the lack of basic understandings of the theology of money, is something that bespeaks to a wider, I think, deeply cultural problem, which goes back again to this hyper-individualistic atmosphere that we're in. I have mine, you have yours. We're in this contractual relationship together in which the primary aspects, if we're honest with ourselves, are romantic affection and physical intimacy. And if those are the two factors, when those two factors no longer are fulfilling themselves, if you no longer have physical intimacy with the other person and you no longer are interested in being around them, guess what happens? You break off the arrangement, right? But I can't tell you how many times. Money issues. But this is where we have to have, for richer or for poorer, there's a reason why this thing is in the marriage vows, okay? There's a reason why that's in the marriage vows. Because it's not about the physical things we own. It is about the eternal aspect of God drawing into relationship these two people in the literal first blessing that God gives to humanity, which is to go forth and multiply, okay? In the anthropological sense, that is like the first thing God does. And if we take that seriously, we need to take that vow seriously, right? For richer, for poorer, okay? You might know where I'm going with this now, right? I'm going to tell you a really tragic story. My pastoral theology professor told this story, that she had a couple come in prospective for marriage and wasn't part of their parish, begin to visit, talk about what marriage means, things like that. And she noticed that the man was not engaging in the conversation about what marriage means and things like that. It was mostly his fiancée who was engaging. And my professor, who was rector of this church at the time, looks at the man and says, "What do you think about what marriage means?" And he basically responded with, "Oh, well, this is all her idea," which very quickly told my pastoral theology professor that, okay, I don't think that you two are interested in a marriage, and made the decision to tell them, I can't marry you. Which is, for a pastor to say that, is a big risk. We do have discretion over who we marry, and we can say no. And she said no. And of course, the woman was not happy, and come back about 3 years later. She was called by a local hospital to come and do a visit. Didn't know that there were any parishioners in the hospital, but she got called by one of the nurses' office and said that she was asked for specifically by name to come for pastoral care. She comes, and it is the woman who she met 3 years earlier. The woman who is in the hospital had in the past 6 months had been diagnosed with breast cancer. and had significant health issues. And the man who she had ended up getting married at another place left her because of it. She was alone, she had no support system, and she had a husband who, when sickness came, deserted her. In sickness and in health. There's a reason that vow's in there. There's a reason why we vow the things that we do. We have to take the time when we undergo bad times. And we have an astonishingly low amount of patience to be able to actually go through those times with people. And again, this is why it's not our own effort alone. That's why we say that God does the marriage. I don't know how I'm able to make it through some of these times. You know, in my marriage relationship, we've not had major amounts of like life-threatening sicknesses, but let me tell you what, we got our issues. We got our sickness issues, okay? And we've got sicknesses of body, mind, and spirit that are pretty significant. Are we willing to stick through it in sickness and in health? That is the Christian vow we make in marriage, to take the time to do so. Okay? And then let's just be honest with it. Until death do us part. The question that people who have been in long-term marriages often are asked is, how did you guys stick together for all those years? In fact, we have in our congregation, we had a couple in our congregation that celebrated their 75th wedding anniversary. 75th. The wife has passed on to glory now, but both of them were centenarians. They were in their hundreds before one of them died. And they celebrated 75 years of marriage. We sent them a big card and stuff like that. But one of the questions that they get, that people that have lived that long, have been married for that long, get asked, how did you stay married all that time? And I love the answer that most of them give, which is, I don't know. But they'll usually say, all I know is that I can't live without the other. And in fact, it is often the case that when people who've been in long-term marriages, when one passes away, it is not unusual for the other to pass very soon to when they do. It's almost as if the two have become one person. You know, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I wonder what the Bible has to say about that, right? There is a long-term virtue that people who have been married for that long, who've been fidelitous for that long, there is a deeply spiritual, holy virtue about that length of time, and the fact that it speaks, I think very importantly, that it wasn't their doing. Their first response, right, is, I don't know how we've been able to do it. Well, isn't that a great indication that maybe it was God who did it, right? Maybe it really was, like our vows said, that God is the guarantor. God is the creator of this, right? And that these vows that we're making to each other is in the presence of God who's doing it, right? But that death do us part is such a deeply important part of that taking time. Am I willing to take that time that God eternally takes with me? Am I willing to take the time that Jesus eternally has given me to be able to spend, right? And in that way, how is marriage, again, as we talk about in the sacraments, and the definition of sacraments in the Anglican tradition is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace that are sure and certain means by which that grace is communicated, okay? the outward and visible sign of these two people in fidelity to each other, regardless of circumstance, is meant to be an outward and visible sign of a real inward and spiritual faith in the reality of who God is, in God's relationship to the world. Or, to use Paul's language, God's relationship to the bride of Christ, which is the church. Okay? So, the marriage relationship between Christ and his church. Okay? So, in that way, marriage is meant to be the working out of that taking time, the taking of long-term time. In fact, taking of the longest term time that we can imagine as humans, because it takes until death do us part. And in that way, the ways in which marriage is the school of learning how to love, the school of learning how to do this thing that God has done for me, is part of that lifelong vow that we take. And without those vows and the undergirding of that relationship, then everything is on shifting sand. But because we're founded on the foundation of who God is, and likewise, we're building upon that fidelity of God to his people, and that we are, in fact, not simply acting out, but we're actually participating in that reality that we are joined together not by our own power alone, but by God's power. That gives us significant sort of understanding of the timelessness, the going beyond simply chronology, but simply participating in this big reality of God's fidelity to us here as humans. Hopefully we've come to understand the importance of the marriage vows as it comes to the particular aspect of time taking. Again, disciplines take time. Discipleship takes time. Getting better at something takes time. I mean, there's a reason why we have practice for sports and for music and for art and all kinds of things. We have all kinds of ways in which we kind of recognize that. But marriage is also an aspect. It is also the taking time of the discipline of marriage. Thank goodness we don't have to have it all together by the time we walk down the aisle. In fact, the opposite is true. We are the least together when we walk down the aisle. Now, we've certainly made solemn vows within that ceremony in the church, but we have no idea what we're doing when we walk out that door. We have no idea what we're doing when we have that first week of living together, right? Marriage becomes very, very real whenever you have to deal with the other person's laundry, right? But do we take the time to grow in love? That's, I think, a chiefly important thing that, to be completely honest, I don't think I had considered how much the importance of that was until reading Matthew Bullimore's chapter. And I commend it to you. For you who are married, or for you who are prospecting in marriage, or for you who have not been married yet, think about the importance of time-taking in any aspect, but particularly in marriage. To have the reality of the truth of the fact that the marriage ceremony is a solemn vow that we undertake for the purpose of learning how to love more fully. And that loving more fully really will take our lifetime, and really will take our fidelity to this specific person only in the Christian sense. And that we don't have to be scared of that. We actually can be very excited about that. And that even in the worst circumstance that we can imagine, even in a cancer diagnosis, even in the loss of a job, even in the tragedy of losing a parent or a child or a sudden death of a friend, that in all of that, we are being joined together by God who is with us through it all. And maybe that's the most important part. which is that thank God that we don't have to do this marriage thing alone, but that we are simply and faithfully being brought together by God, who is the one who is making the marriage work.